please join me in a very warm welcome for Dr. David Shulkin, 9th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and Dr. Andrew von Eschenbach, former Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. They will be joining us for a fireside chat on the future of pharmaceutical regulation. Please welcome them.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and it's been a terrific morning, and we're looking forward to spending some time with you. I think, just for those of you who don't know, Dr. von Eschenbach was not only the director of the Food and Drug Administration, but also of the National Cancer Institute. And Andy, there's not much happening in the world, so I don't know if we're going to have a lot to talk about, but
Been quiet.
But we'll try. So first of all, you're a Philadelphian, huh?
You bet. South Philadelphia.
South Philly.
Yeah.
All right. And so tell us about where you trained in the beginning of your career.
Well, you know, David, I think you and I share the fact that we've lived through what is the most profound transformation to occur in the entire history of medicine. For me, that began here in Philadelphia, deciding to be a pre-med at St. Joe's University, and then I went on to Georgetown Medical School. But my career took me to MD Anderson, where for 26 years I was boots on the ground, practicing urologic oncology, doing research, taking care of patients. And like you, during that period of time, we saw this transformation from an era of observing manifestations and then empirically trying to figure out what to do about them, to now beginning to understand mechanisms, the fundamental genetic, molecular, and cellular mechanisms that were underlying and give rising to diseases like cancer and all the others. And from there, I had the privilege of going into government, being the director of the National Cancer Institute, which is like an AWACS plane where I could see all the parts and pieces. And then to the FDA, which is like a spy satellite, because we could begin to see what was still on the other side of the horizon. And so for us, it's been a privilege to now realize we're in a completely new era of medicine. And now, as that's unfolding, as we are understanding mechanisms, along comes this powerful tool of AI. And so it's a privilege to be here and share that with this audience, because as you've said so often, the future's within our grasp.
Right. Well, look, I want to get back just a little bit to your career. So you're a urologic oncologist. You're at the prime of your career. Your mother's probably happy. She's got a doctor. And then you ruin your career by deciding to go into government. And so a lot of people must ask you, why would you do that? Why would you, given everything that we see that it takes to sometimes be an agency head, including what's happened to the CDC director recently, why did you decide to go into government?
Well, I know one thing about you, and I know one thing about this audience just because the fact they're there. We all have a gene in us that wants to make a difference. And we're all seeking that quest as to how to do that. For me, I wanted to make a difference in the life of a patient with cancer. And then I found myself being afforded the opportunity to take that from one cancer at a time, one patient at a time, to maybe changing the system. And you have been a champion of changing the system and what you were able to accomplish at the VA. And I know already from this audience that they are in the business of making a difference. So it was an evolution of scale, if you will, but purpose never changed.
Yeah. Now, when you're in that role, either as the head of the FDA or the NCI, how do you balance science and politics? And, because these are politically appointed roles, and we're seeing that play out now. So how did you balance those issues?
Well, first of all, everything begins with science because it is the basis for evidence. And without that, you have no foundation. But I draw a distinction because it's often said, science versus politics. What I found was it wasn't politics, it's science and policy. And there's a difference between policy and politics. So for example, a simple one I'll give you is, from a science point of view, we knew at the FDA that milk coming from a cloned cow was perfectly normal and equivalent to milk coming from any native cow. But it was a cloned animal. From a science point of view, no reason not to put that into the milk supply. From a policy point of view, given trade issues, and if we mixed cloned milk into our milk supply and not be able to track and trace, it would destroy all of our cheese exports from this country. So from a policy standpoint, not a good idea. Politics is something that we recognize occurs, but I think as agency heads, leave the politics to the politicians. We stick with science and policy.
Well, let's talk a little bit about whether that's the world that we live in today. Things are moving pretty quickly. Would you agree that they move quicker now than when you were running the agencies?
Well, I think the pace of everything is changing. This conversation we're having today, what I look at, and you and I have discussed this, is whether we're talking about the practice of medicine or whether we're talking about running an agency like the FDA and regulating drugs and devices, it's a data management business. Physicians, you and I, we encounter a patient, first thing we do is we acquire data. Take a history, do a physical, get lab studies, do x-rays. We acquire data, we aggregate it into information, we then analyze it, and then act upon it. And until we get to that point where the analysis has led us to knowledge, we have not yet created a value proposition. So we have to get to that knowledge. We have to get to that analysis. And we have to take each of those three components and recognize that they are changing incredibly rapidly. The data is radically different today than what you and I first were dealing with when we went to medical school. It's one thing to do a family history. Now you got to get a genetic profile. The point I'm making is the data itself has changed. The volume of data is expanded exponentially, and the diversity of the data, the nature of it, is also radically different. So yes, things are accelerating exceedingly rapidly. We're in what I call the upslope of an exponential curve, where it's not going to take us 5 years, it may take us 2. And we have to develop the tools that we're talking about here today to be able to manage that challenge.
I have no doubt that that's the case, that we are seeing that rapid acceleration of data and that the industry is going to be challenged to deal with that. But I think what people are seeing playing out right now on the TV, if people, or on their phones as they stream, is another type of acceleration that's different than just the data, Andy. If you take a look at the data on whether vaccines work, if you take a look at whether you should get a COVID vaccine, I got mine 2 days ago, my booster. If you take a look at this recent issue about autism and the linkage potentially, or at least the claim linkage to Tylenol without any real data, Andy, that doesn't seem to follow the model you're talking about, because if it's purely a data issue, I don't think we'd be seeing some of these controversies play out.
Well, I think the problem is it's a perversion of the process. The process I described is you start with the data, but that's not the end of the process. There's an aggregation and there's an analysis until you get to that point, what I am seeing happen is someone takes a piece of data or a few and immediately leapfrogs to, I know. Someone took Tylenol and the child had autism. I know it was causal. You don't know it was causal because there are all the other data elements you haven't paid attention to, like why did that mother take the Tylenol? Perhaps she had a viral infection and a fever. So was it the virus or was it the Tylenol? This process and the tools that you are applying to it require rigor, discipline, and precision. And if we don't have that, then we don't have evidence. We have opinions.
Well, I think what we've seen in many, many public polls recently is the American public, maybe even broader than the American public, has lost a great deal of confidence in its agencies and the ability to make recommendations based upon science. So how do we restore public confidence by going back to some of the things you're talking about? Is it even possible at this point to restore the confidence in the CDC, the FDA, and other agencies?
Well, you know, you and I as physicians know that when we encounter a patient, it's critically important that they have confidence in us. And the only way we do that is by establishing a relationship with trust. So it begins with trust. And trust begins with the fact that I must communicate to them that they are the end and not the means. If that patient perceives that they're the means for me making the payment on my next BMW or writing the next paper so I'm famous, we got a problem. So I think agencies and I think industries need to start approaching the public, patients, with the understanding of we need to reestablish trust. We need to be candid, honest, forthright. We need to continue to emphasize the fact that what we're about is for them and in their behalf. Is that simple? Is that easy? No. Once you rupture trust in any relationship, it's a tough road to get it back, but we got to get it back.
And are you thinking we're going to see that in the next couple of years, or are you thinking that there may be a strategy where some of this is just meant to shake up the system?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go down the road a little bit, probably since I'm no longer a federal employee, we get to say things we wouldn't normally say.
Right.
I am seeing more hunger for trust. I'm seeing more hunger for integrity. I noticed the drug, I have never liked direct-to-consumer advertising. I understand it sells things. I understand it can educate people about conditions they may be avoiding, depression or whatever. But I've been always concerned that when you put an advertisement for a drug in between trying to sell somebody soap and a new car, you've treated them as a customer and you're trying to sell something to them. They don't get the message you're trying to do something. I just saw a commercial from a #1 pharmaceutical company that said nothing about their product and only about the welfare of a patient. That is a positive step forward.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think if we start seeing that in the public sector, among politicians and policymakers, I think if we start seeing that in industry, in relationships, it'll come back.
Yeah. Well, it's a good transition. This is largely a commercial pharmaceutical audience, and you mentioned D2C, so I'm sure a lot of people are interested in that. We've seen this administration put out 100 warning letters recently, taking aim at the D2C practices of the industry. And the industry is very concerned about what they're seeing coming out of the White House and what the president's talking about with most favored nation pricing, with tariffs, with other types of pressure that they're feeling. And so if you're watching all of this and you're a pharmaceutical company, do you have any advice how to sort of navigate through this?
Absolutely. And I'll relate a real conversation I had when I was back at FDA with a senior member of Congress, committee chair, who insisted that we prohibit the distribution of materials to physicians by drugs detailers. And I vehemently oppose that, because I think the industry has a very profound, important role in education. There's no one who knows more about your drug than you do. And when you have peer-reviewed data, evidence, that needs to be disseminated and shared by you to both physicians and patients. So I actually am in favor of direct-to-consumer communication, but I'd like to see that more in the context of educating patients, more in the context of making them aware of risks associated with disease states that are going unrecognized and uncared for. And so I want more communication between industry and physicians. I desperately want more communication between industry and the FDA. Who knows more about a drug that the FDA is supposed to regulate than the people who made it? So when I heard all of this craziness about there was too much communication by the FDA with the sponsors of the first drug, Aldohelm, for Alzheimer's, who else should the FDA be talking to? Do we need panels of people, advisors, that know about the drug because they're actually engaged? Absolutely. Do you have to deal with some conflict of interest questions? Fine, deal with them. But don't cut off the expertise. So I hope I'm making myself clear to this audience. I'm in favor of interaction and communication, but that's communication that's putting the patient as the center and as the end.
Yeah. And, I think you'd get a lot of support from this audience for that, because I think that the intent of getting objective evidence out there into the hands of both patients and providers is certainly important. But I think this audience is probably even more concerned about the unpredictability of the environment right now. And, I've had a number of conversations with President Trump about drug pricing. President Trump, as most people know, is not generally a very empathetic person in his personality, but when I've talked to him about drug pricing, this is a issue that he actually shows empathy on, that he feels that Americans who can't afford medications, who don't have access to things that he does, really are being treated unfairly. And he's very focused on that Americans are paying more for the same drug than people in other countries. He's got a very deep focus on that issue, and that leads him to this most favored nation pricing. What are the dangers if the United States adopts most favored nation pricing for the industry?
I think we're treating a symptom, but we're not getting to the core of the disease. For the longest period of time, other countries have basically had price controls, and they have not underwritten and supported the development of biomedical research and the biopharma industry to the way the United States has. We've been extremely generous. And I presented to OECD at one point, their ministers of health and ministers of finance, about where medicine was taking us and what new drugs and things would be coming along and the costs associated with that. And the plea to them was to share more in those costs of development, because we were under increasing pressure with regard to price controls, which would significantly impair our ability to divert a lot of that revenue back into R&D. And basically the response we got was, we're not going to do that. You're rich, you can afford it. And besides, some of us think you owe it to us. So we have to think about, this is a US issue, but it's a global problem. We all have to share in the cost of R&D. As far as the US is concerned, frankly, I sit on a board of a pharmaceutical company, and I have no way of understanding what our price of the drug is and what somebody is paying at the CVS pharmacy and everything that goes on in the middle. And my son, who's an expert in revenue cycle and everything else, has explained it to me 3 times, and I still can't get it. And I don't think I'm stupid, because I can get out some pretty significant tumors and have patients survive, but I can't understand it.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that. Just before we move off the topic of pricing, I just wonder what your thoughts are. Do you think drug pricing is in the realm of the FDA, or do you think that it really is more on CMS and other policy? And, Mehmet Oz, who of course runs CMS, is actually in the White House almost every day talking about MFN pricing. The president, of course, has given a September 30th deadline. The industry has largely tried to pretend that doesn't exist, waiting to see in this negotiation what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
But I think CMS is going to be stepping up in this as the weeks start coming in. But what do you think the role of FDA
you've
is?
opened up an hour conversation. First of all, to answer your question, absolutely not. The FDA should not make any decisions about the science, the efficacy and safety of a drug based on what its price might or might not be. It should do that on the science and the evidence around the performance of that drug, and we can get into that in more detail. As far as then what the value of that drug is, and its cost and its price, and et cetera, we need a complete overhaul of how we think about that and how we manage that. Because increasingly what we are going to see is that patients do not want a drug or a device or a biologic. They want a solution to their problem. And that solution is going to require the complex interoperable integration of components. So we better start thinking of our industry like the computer industry. I wouldn't give Andy Grove 5 cents for his microprocessor. We were good friends. Because I said, it doesn't do anything for me until you put it together with Bill Gates' software and Cisco's hard drive, and you give me a PC and I can do my word processing. That's the same model for what we have to provide for the successful treatment of complex diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, and all the rest. It's going to require the complex interoperable integration of components. How do we pay for each component? How do we pay for the solution? How do we determine the value proposition? Talking about vaccines, for example, when you treat someone with a vaccine and you create herd immunity, there's a value proposition for the rest of society that never got the vaccine. How, as a healthcare system, do we calculate that? And I don't want to go down this road too far, but my point to you all, and where maybe tools like AI can become a really important asset, is we've had a lot of innovation in discovery. We've had a tremendous amount of innovation in development, but we have had very little innovation in the delivery of healthcare.
Well, I think you're right. I think this issue of moving off of our traditional paradigm of pricing to more of an outcomes-based contracting system, that's maybe value-based, right? Maybe they'll invite us back next year to talk more about that, because that's I think clearly the future. But in the few seconds that we have left, I'm just going to ask you some quick yes or no answers. Is the FDA the right place to be regulating the future of AI, algorithms, large language models?
Yes, provided it becomes expert and adept at that process.
And are they there now?
No.
Okay.
I don't think anybody's there now.
Okay.
I think we're all engaged in learning. I think that's why we're having conferences like this. And the point of the story is I don't want to see an agency try to evolve independently in order to then address what's evolving externally. I think this has to be a joint venture. And I think there's a great experiment waiting for that within the FDA. If you give me one more second, if you think about this, every single drug, every single biologic, every single device for decades and decades that's ever been developed that was approved or not approved is sitting within a vault at the FDA. All of that data. It used to be on paper in a literal vault. It's now in the cloud. But that is the Fort Knox of data. It becomes a perfect platform to be able to introduce the opportunity for AI to be transformational in that. It becomes a learning opportunity. It becomes an experiential opportunity. So I think FDA should be the regulatory agency, but it needs to be an AI learning agency. And it can learn internally and use it internally and then perhaps become much more adept at making external decisions.
Great. I think we're going to try to take an audience question now. And I don't know who's going to pick the person.
Hi, over here, Thiago. So thank you, excellent conversation, really enjoyed it. Dr. von Eschenbach, I have a question about the FDA. From my analysis of how business works here in America, I'm originally from Brazil, is that there's this perception that we should let business self-regulate. And then something happens and someone says, why didn't the government step in? So I'm curious to know about your time in the FDA, how much did you actually have in terms of capacity to regulate, and how much people have an inflated expectation of what the FDA can do, and how did you balance that?
I don't know that I could say that I encountered an inflated expectation. I think the expectations were kind of biphasic. Either we were too slow or we were too fast. So I think if I'm understanding your question, the regulatory process really needs to be transparent. There needs to be an understanding of what happens when data comes in the form of an application and what steps evolve to the point where the FDA renders a decision. So I think that part of the process can become much more transparent and subject to much more process improvement and oversight. And I think that empowers the agency to deal with whatever challenge it comes. I don't see restrictions to the, if I understood your question, the FDA is not restricted in regulating. It just needs to do it in a way that establishes the kind of trust that Dr. Shulkin's been asking for. You believe it when I say it.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks so much.